we covering everything. I'm talking that news you ain't heard of, cause you know it's getting buried. Social justice, yeah, the stuff you need to know about. Fucking politics that the corporate news won't cover. You know they don't think that you could see under, but you can now, cause the people we cover, they may not be famous, but their stories should be heard. Yeah, every voice matters.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday morning. This is Hair of the Dog. I am Carrie Barber, and you are watching us on the brand new Digital Liberation Front Media Network. Yay! So we'll get some of our branding and songs changed out as we go through, but there's so much news going on, we didn't have time. So we prioritized covering the news for you. So before we get started in that, let me pass it over to my lovely and talented co-host, Andy Kennedy. Hello, Andy.
Hello, Carrie.
So what people don't know is before we go streaming, we end up in some weird conversation, and it's very animated. And this morning it was totally non sequitur. We were looking for an old song. So Andy, did you find out who it was? I don't think it was the B-52s. I think it was Iggy.
I'm not sure. I don't know the song. See, that time period of music was kind of difficult if you were a musician, and depending on what genre you were included in as a musician, right? At that time, I think I was right into my first real gig with a band that was called Free Advice. And that was just a three-piece, just a power trio. We did a lot of Canadian rock music, and
so
it was like the first real forte.
Did you do like
music.
Look Both Ways before you cross the streets, or what is Free Advice? How did that play into the music at all?
It wasn't. It was just I just thought it was a cool name.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good.
And that's it. Just that's how I've always come up with names for bands. Every band I've been in, with the exception of the one I'm in right now, because it's a tribute band. But every other band I've ever played in, I've always come up with the name. Don't know why.
Well,
but now we're getting off topic here. Now
we are,
because of the rock, and then of course there was a band that was my forte into the original music act, which was more like just kind of a mix mash of different styles that the industry called adult contemporary, right? So that whole time in the 80s music, when digital synth sounds of where the new punk movement kind of came out of the 80s, but then you had the new wave sound, with the strange hair and the headless guitars and basses and synth moog sounds and all that stuff. It was very strange for an old rocker like myself to go through that, right? Because first of all, I wasn't going to get a Flock of Seagulls haircut. There was no frickin' way, right?
I remember that with all the gel, and yeah, I remember.
Oh, but if in the 70s, if you were lucky enough to have a hairspray company, but that was a strange changeover. So a lot of the music that came out in the 80s, I was familiar with, but I wasn't really listening to a lot because I was still, listening to the music of the 60s and 70s, right? And because I was born halfway through the 60s, so I didn't really get my musical feet underneath me until well into the 70s, but there was all this great music behind me that I wanted to listen to, right? And that was an influence from my parents and people I hung out with and stuff.
Now, mind you, this song that started this whole conversation, I was in high school, so it was not the kind of music I listened to in high school. I was listening to Green Day and all the other revolutionaries. Oh, Wow, we have Miss Hargrove with us this morning. Good morning, and I'm gonna butcher your name, so I'm not even it's a beautiful name, and I screwed up. Shandale. Shan. I'm sorry, it's too early. But Miss Hargrove.
Sean Daly?
Yes,
Sean Daly?
yes, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful name, and I did not get the right pronunciation. But good morning, welcome to the show. So this morning we're supposed to have a pretty special guest, but it always makes me nervous when we have a guest on from the Pacific Coast because it's like 7 in the morning there, and
And it's funny you should mention that.
oh, is he here?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. So this morning, let's set this up properly. This morning, we are talking about fascism. Fascism has taken over an American city. And what's fun and interesting to me is all the Trumpers who are coming up with such great excuses like, well, there's graffiti and they broke a window. Therefore, let's shred the Constitution. So those are the conversations that have been happening for the last week. Last week, you'll recall that Andy and I talked about what was going on there, and some of the new developments that have come out is just like it's mind-boggling. So now we have somebody that has been dubbed Captain Portland. This is a Navy veteran who was beaten and maced simply for asking these unmasked or these unnamed soldiers who have just suddenly appeared in a secret police form if they are upholding their oath. So here's a veteran who took the same oath, asking them, hey, is this living your oath? So they beat him. And you can see the video of him standing there just taking it. They broke his hand in 2 places, this type of thing. So the other thing that came out of this was the wall of moms. So what happened there was moms went out there and stood in the front line to protect the younger protesters behind them, and they were subject to chemical weapons attack. So the next day, even more moms showed up. And what was interesting to me is moms who would not normally get involved in a civil action, when they saw what happened to other moms, oh boy, this huge wall of moms showed up dressed in yellow vests, had sunflowers and all sorts of things, and they held the line as long as they could against the fascist officers. Yes, the thugs who are part of the secret police, who apparently don't have to honor the Constitution or civil rights. So thank you for pointing that out. Yes, armed militia thugs. Thank you for that. So yeah, we're a little early, but Andy, you want to introduce our very special guest?
Well, I would love to. And we now have, um, now the reason we moved to 10 o'clock is because it's unfair to ask activist progressive people to get up at 6 in the morning after a night of online activism, trolling and crap and stuff. So that's why we moved to 10, so we could at least allow them to get up at 7. It was a little better.
A little better, a little better.
Right. As a musician, I always thought that if you're up at 7, it's just because you shouldn't have gone to bed yet, right? And so, but anyways, welcome, Gregory.
Hi there.
It's lovely to see you this morning.
Gregory. Good morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so we actually featured your Twitter feed last week because you came out with some really great stuff from a political standpoint, and I totally agreed with you about your Twitter thread last week was on the streaming video that Portland police were doing. So on one hand, Portland was saying, "Oh, we're not cooperating in any way with these federal troops." But yet here they were putting out this live stream, and then lo and behold, people are getting picked up and kidnapped on the street. So, so I recognized right away what you were talking about with the Ted Cruz and his 14 hours of B-roll. So what's going on now in Portland? because we're seeing all sorts of conflicting reports. What's the real story? What's going on?
So I think that is part of one of the most frustrating things for people on the ground here that have been working in politics on activism in Portland. And sorry, I'm joining you from my bed because my children and stuff are getting ready for daycare upstairs, and I was told to be in a quiet place, and this is the only quiet place left in my house at this point. I swear I did get up at like 6:30, so I didn't just join you from waking up, but the thread that I posted was really just the beginning of what I was trying to line out of the cooperation between our local police force and the federal government. And what's the most frustrating thing for people on the ground here is to see our elected officials, specifically our mayor, appear as though he is some sort of resistance hero because he's willing to go on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and say, I want Donald Trump's federal officers out of here. And, that is happening almost simultaneously as both the Portland Police Bureau and the federal officers are firing the same weapons shoulder to shoulder at protesters. And so I don't pretend to know what's in our Mayor Ted Wheeler's mind, but I do know what's happening on the streets, which is that there is heavy collaboration between the two. And since I've posted that thread that has been admitted, multiple members of the Portland Police Bureau met with DHS head Wolf when he came to Portland, and that was without the chief of police even knowing or saying that that he didn't know that they were meeting. They fire on us shoulder to shoulder. They attack at the same time. Sometimes you have situations where Portland police come from the east or west and are pushing people towards the federal officers. And so I think that's one thing that I would like to get across to people on the national scene, that this is not all about Trump, right? Trump came in because we had 50 days of consecutive protests. And those 50 days of consecutive protests were not about Donald Trump. Those 50 days of consecutive protests were spurred like the rest of the country because of the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. But also we're talking about many Black individuals in Portland who have been killed by Portland police: Quantas Hayes, Kendra James, Keaton Otis, Patrick Kimmons, Terrell Johnson. The list goes on of people in Portland who are Black and murdered by the police department.
Oh, totally makes sense. And in fact, we had done, I actually wrote up a story about police departments in consent decree. But let's back up to something that you said earlier about your mayor denying coordination with these federal agents. So we just learned, we all had this really big civics lesson from DC's Mayor Bauer when Trump had those troops in and he was doing his photo op and all of that. We learned that the mayor of the city has to cooperate in order for those troops to come in. At that point, it was the National Guard. And so when she said, enough is enough, get out, they had to leave. So why are the troops still in Portland if your mayor is pretending or saying that he's not cooperating?
Sure. I think that it's a little different when it's actually the Department of Homeland Security, because they are protecting or say that they are protecting federal buildings in Portland. So the nights of protests happen in these parks that are downtown. On one side is our Portland City Hall, but also we have an IRS building, another federal building that are sort of sandwiching this entire area. And so they say that they're there to protect those federal buildings. And then also in that park, we do have some monuments, I guess, that might be covered by Donald Trump's executive order. We have one of a pioneer family that is seen as racist and offensive. And so they could be protecting that due to the president's executive order. But the troops that are here are Border Patrol and Homeland Security troops, and they're not trained in crowd control at all. They're trained in extreme violence, and they are doing it. But the thing is, they are deploying tear gas, but Portland Police is also deploying tear gas. They're beating people, Portland Police is beating people. The difference, though, is we have some level of accountability with the mayor, because obviously he is in a re-election bid. and our city council, all are basically our civilian oversight of our Portland Police Bureau. But with the feds, there's nothing, there's no accountability measures, and that's what's different. And I do think that the mayor's hands are tied a bit in forcing the feds to leave, but there's certainly more that he could be doing, whether it's to end all cooperation or even what I think would be a really profound and powerful act is if the Portland police are here to protect and serve Portland constituents and Portland community members, why are they not have the protesters to their back rather than face down with the protesters and face the federal troops in what is supposed to be a sanctuary city?
Good point. So one of our viewers provided this question. This is from David. He's talking about, I don't know if you read it, the New York Times article that just came out that said anarchists are impeding Black Lives Matter's progress. So they're trying to pit this entire protest as separate factions working against each other, and the federal agents are there to kind of keep the peace. So are you seeing any of that? Is there a faction of anarchists who are elevating this, or what exactly is going on here?
Sure, I think that there's a bit of confusion of what an anarchist even is, right? I'm not an anarchist, but I think anarchism is a legitimate political ideology that does not mean what I think it is used for in the popular sense, which is an anarchist means that when you go outside, you just want to smash stuff and you want to see chaos and fires and stuff like that. That's not what the political theory of anarchism is, right? Anarchism has a long storied past with the Spanish Civil War, French Revolution, all throughout the entire world and now. So, and then the article, I haven't read it, but it sounds like we're acting as though there are not Black anarchists, and there are certainly many Black anarchists, especially in a town like Portland. I think in any protest, everybody comes there for their own personal reasons and different reasons. And sure, maybe in a crowd of 500 or 1,000 or 10,000, there could be a certain amount of individuals who are there to inflict what I think is popularly known as anarchy. I think that what detracts from the Black Lives Matter movement is not necessarily those small, isolated, and usually victimless actions, but rather the focus and discussion on them. And so, yeah, there's things get spray painted, right? Sometimes windows get broken, and even we had one night 45 days ago of looting, right? None of that adds up to George Floyd's life. None of that adds up to Kwame Faye's life, who was killed here in Portland. And so I think the distraction is actually when we have national media and local media focusing on those elements rather than the vast majority of the protests. It's funny because these same people that are back the blue or Blue Lives Matter people say it's just bad apples. It doesn't mean everybody's bad, but they don't apply that same logic to protesters, right? Mm-hmm. I also think that many movements, you don't have Martin without Malcolm, and many movements have sort of this dichotomy or this dialectic between two different elements at the protest that synergize into whatever the protest becomes, but it doesn't mean that one is invalid, because I do think the rage that occurs sometimes of feeling that unheard is not because there's something incredibly flawed with those individuals, but rather they're reacting to an incredibly flawed system. And in 100 years, the history books will never read, there was also graffiti on the building. They're going to read about this massive uprising, and that's what I think matters, and that's what will matter in the future.
Excellent point. So, Andy, as Gregory was talking, it kind of flashed back to the comment that you made last week about the economic positives. Not that we're trying to encourage rioting, but there is an economic positive that can come from this kind of redistribution. Do you want to refresh us on that one?
Well, absolutely. And that all goes with the narrative of how, the neoliberalism and the the neoliberalist government has tried to keep the narrative going that property is more important than life, right? Like that we have to protect the things, and we have to shoot the people that want to do damage to them, right? I mean, when you think of it in those terms, those things didn't elect the government officials that are making these decisions. It's supposed to be representing the people, but we have to. And I've had pushback from Atlanta, from the Wendy's that was burned down, that all of those people lost their jobs, and why did they have to burn it down? Oh yeah, sure, that's an entire race of people that have been suppressed for 400 years, but why did a few people have to lose their minimum wage jobs? My goodness, what are we thinking, right? And so that whole narrative of property being more valuable than people's lives is, and we see that in the pandemic, right? We see that about how the federal government has defunded people and the states and municipalities, right? Like the Trump has the mayor of Portland by the curlies because the narrative is, well, you know, we're not gonna help you out unless you play ball with us, right? It's all about money. It's all about corruption. We see that now in terms of what's happening in protests. If we can understand that you know, most of the people that are protesting are doing it because they're in the majority of Americans that have nothing left to lose, right? They don't necessarily have anything more than a minimum wage job if they're working at all right now. They don't have the ability to protect themselves, right? And so looting that happens during the protests, and this was, you know, a great narrative when we were talking about a window getting broken, people going into a store and taking things out of the store. And there's absolutely no way that these people that are taking these things can afford to go out and buy them to begin with. And we look back at New York City and the riots then, and at that time, there was one DJ in every square mile of New York City. And after the protests, there were 16 DJs in every mile. And why is that? It's because the looting allowed poor people to go in and get the equipment that they never would have been able to get otherwise, right? And enrich society with music. And so that whole narrative of protecting property, right? Because all those stores, they have insurance. They don't really lose anything. We just say that it's bad because it's property. Right?
So, well, to that point, and Gregory, I think you mentioned it in your excellent explanation. The value of property and the value of lives, or lives in terms of civil rights, these things are not equal, right?
Yes, it's not even close. And you know, the windows can be replaced, and graffiti can be washed over, and insurance covers most of the losses from looting. We had a situation in Portland where the Portland Business Alliance, who has been pushing really hard for Portland and Oregon to reopen. There's sort of this entity, I guess, kind of like a chamber of commerce, but they push against any progressive legislation or taxation, etc. And they've been pushing for Portland to reopen. They put out this statistic that the protests have cost Portland businesses $23 million, and the media just reported it. And then they had to backtrack and say, oh, actually, it looks like most of that money was due to the loss because of the pandemic. We have people from national media that are visiting Portland and seeing boarded up windows downtown. Those windows were boarded up long before there were any protests because these businesses are closed. Or saying that businesses have been shuttered because of the protests. No, the pandemic has been a much larger impact on our economy, both in Portland and nationally. And so if people are really worried about the economic fallout of actions of elected officials or lack of actions from elected officials. They should talk about the fact that this pandemic has been allowed to grow so much worse because of the negligence of our officials.
Makes absolute sense. So while we were talking and getting ready for the show, I just out of curiosity looked up the Department of Justice consent decrees, because when a city or municipal police force is found negligent of upholding their own oaths and laws, they can be forced into a consent decree, same way that a corporation can if their equipment or other things are detrimental to the public. Portland has been under a consent decree since 2014 for excessive use of force. So it seems to me that corporate media and national media, as well as perhaps local media, has neglected to report on this ongoing pervasive issue in Portland, and the response to it appropriately would be these protests, Black Lives Matter and all of these other things. But instead, they're using these, forwarding the narratives like we discussed about the cost of windows and rioting, and now this new one where there's an attack on the Black Lives Matter organization and trying to lump the movement in with the organization itself. So what is the word in Portland? I mean, is anyone talking about this consent decree that's drug on now for a number of years, or that's not getting any play?
Yeah, ours is a little different than a lot of places because it was due to the way that Portland police were handling people in mental health crises. And because of that, we were required to set up oversight boards that have now had, I think, 3 different iterations just since the DOJ has been in town. That happened under the Obama administration, and once the Trump administration came in, the requirements were much more lax, and actually we are heading towards that being over with. We have been found to be in compliance now, which is interesting, and I think most people would disagree, including most of the oversight boards. And so we're really getting towards the end of that process. But at the same time, Portland police, over 50% of their arrests are of houseless individuals. And so that means that over half of the people that they are arresting were homeless when they were arresting them, which means that it's for minor things. We have this thing in Portland. I don't know if it happens in every city, where if a camping site, meaning that people are sleeping on the street, is reported, then it gets swept. They take all their stuff and tell you to leave, and they give you a piece of paper with the resources of where you can find services. And oftentimes in those sweeps, somebody ends up getting arrested, whether it be for a warrant, a drug pipe, for resisting the sweep, anything like that.
Wow. Okay, so that was what we saw here in the first days of the escalation that was happening, is that there were so many homeless people getting arrested as part of these protests too. So that didn't make a whole lot of sense as to why these people are considered a threat, other than their mere existence in the city is kind of a blight on the leadership. So we see this again and again in different cities. Here in Chicago, we have the same problem. So you have the police force, who is not acting appropriately with mental health issues, excessive force, that sort of thing, making sweeps of the homeless community. And at the same time, you have all of these protesters out trying to rectify what's going on, while the federal government is walking back requirements on a consent decree. Do I have all of this right? Because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, and I will say one of the cool things that have popped up since the protests occurred is that there is a makeshift sort of like food cart that has popped up called Riot Ribs. And they have been feeding people constantly all day and night, 24 hours a day. It's a lot of homeless youth that are doing the cooking. There's a lot. They're feeding the houseless. The place where the protest is taking place, there's a lot of houseless individuals in that area that is their home that is getting tear gassed every day. So that has been really cool. There's lines around the block and stuff sometimes, and everything is free. I've been trying to donate to them as much as I can, and people come and volunteer. But what's been so heinous is that multiple times they've had everything stolen from them by the police. One time they were getting ready to go, got everything loaded up into a U-Haul, and police popped the U-Haul tires and then towed the U-Haul. And so luckily they have all this community support, but every day they're getting gas. Yesterday I saw a tweet from them. They're really funny too. Yesterday I saw a tweet from them that said, "We're getting tear gassed now." And then 10 minutes later, I saw a reply to that tweet from them that said, "We're still grilling though." If people ask what the special recipe is, they say seasoned salt and tear gas.
Oh my goodness.
It's got a bit of an aftertaste.
Yeah, spicy.
Yeah, extra spicy. So for somebody like me now, I'm already getting word, and we're getting forewarning that Milwaukee and Chicago are next. And I gotta tell you, it's not gonna go well in Chicago. It hasn't for years. We know that we are frontline for targeting by Trump. But so here I'm in Illinois, you're in Portland. What can I do to help? Because if we can stop this behavior in Portland, then maybe Milwaukee and Chicago don't have to go through the exact same thing. Like, well, we still are. Over the weekend, we had our own police force knock out the teeth of a woman who was peacefully protesting. Not okay. In Joliet, Illinois, we have police arresting peaceful protesters with no charges. Not okay. What can we do to push back from the rest of the country here to help you in Portland and get this to stop?
I think it's going to be up to the people in the streets in Portland to make this. This is not something that's going to end quickly. A lot of national media has flown in here to get the story. And I don't know if they know Portlanders, but if they want to stay for the entire story, they're going to be here for months on end, because it's not going to end here. What I think could happen in other cities, which is what I would suggest to elected officials, the problem is our mayor is in a really tough place right now because he has used the same tactics against protesters as Donald Trump is now. He has used the same rhetoric saying that protesters are all violent anarchists or outside agitators as the president. And that puts him in a place where we're now seeing them not fight over how to deal with protesters or whether protests are bad and should be quelled, but rather who gets to do it. And so I think the way to prevent this in other cities is for the elected officials to be standing with the protesters now. You don't have to agree with every one of them. You don't have to agree with each tactic. You even might go out there and get yelled at by your constituents, which is fine. We live in a democracy. It might be uncomfortable, but that, I think, would be tremendously powerful and help prevent the onslaught from the federal government, because all Donald Trump did was pick up where our mayor had left off, and had our mayor instead been standing with people or giving people what they wanted. We asked the entire community unanimously was asking for the police to be defunded by just $50 million. They defunded the police instead by $15 million, and that really put more fuel to the fire of protesters. And so if elected officials work with the protesters who are on the ground, who know what the community needs in trying to get things done, obviously mayors aren't going to be abolishing their police departments across the country, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing anything. So work with the protesters and activists and longtime organizers in your city. Be out there at the protests, which make it far less likely that your police force ends up attacking the protests. We saw in Atlanta, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and the police chief were at protests, and some of those protests were violent, and the mayor and the police chief were there. And I think in that one day, at that one time, there was not a large police crackdown. And had we had people standing with their constituents, against the federal government, we'll be in a much better spot. I really would liken it to the way that we think about immigration in sanctuary cities, because we always see these stories from the right and from Donald Trump that say, oh, but this one immigrant, there was a murder, or there were this many rapes or assaults and stuff. And yet, our elected officials are constantly like, well, we still are a sanctuary city, right? We're not going to work with the feds. We're going to protect our community members. And yeah, some people commit crimes, and if they commit crimes, they go through our criminal justice system through our city, and we're going to stop them from being deported just because they're making a mistake in their life. But for some reason, cities are not affording that same attitude of, just because some people commit a crime, we still are going to protect them from fascist goons. Cities, for some reason, are not willing to make the connection of how similar it is. It's supposed to be a sanctuary city, which means we protect our community members from the federal government trying to screw up everybody's lives.
Right. Like, I mean, isn't it? That's my question, the two of you, is, and you know, you have to remember, I'm speaking from Canada, so I'm not that familiar with American laws and the Constitution. But from what I understand, if you have the federal government is completely out of control, not abiding by any laws, firing on citizens in a city, is that not the essence of the Second Amendment? You're not protected by the Second Amendment as a people to arm yourselves and fight back constitutionally.
Yeah, it's funny because all of I mean, like, we can flip the script and say, let's say Obama invades Oklahoma City. Like, the right would be, that's what would happen, right? The right, it does happen, because that's what happened, like Ruby Ridge, even in Oregon, we had a federal building and a county building taken over by right-wing extremists. There's other examples that are, for some reason, Waco, things like this, right? Where the federal government comes and they stand up and fight back, but yet now they're cheering on the federal government. So it appears it was never really about personal liberties or states' rights, but it was actually kind of a bit about racism.
Absolutely, it's about racism.
My shocked look.
And I was having this conversation with an alt-right fascist this morning, because he brought up the Second Amendment, and I'm like, you guys need to understand that as a leftist, I own firearms. I am a lawful FOID card holder, and I do target practice. We're good shots, but it doesn't mean that with what I am allowed to purchase, like, I can't get a tank. I can't get a bazooka legally. And what I have, let's say that wall of moms did arm themselves and go into Portland armed, like we saw in Michigan at the Capitol. Unless those moms are lily white blonde hair, it's not going to go well for them. Right? So these are the realities that we deal with, that what we have in writing and what actually happens in real life are two different things, which is the complete essence of the Black Lives Matter movement. We're all supposed to have equal protection and due process, but we don't, which is why we started these rights. So while the Constitution is there and it is an ideal, we have yet to live up to that standard in so many ways. Hence Black Lives Matter and a bunch of other movements that are going on right now, coalescing around this process. Let's be the people that we said we were in this document that we all say has value. So
yeah, like, I mean, look, I love the story that came out a couple of days ago that showed the difference between, you know, protesters at their state building, peacefully sitting down on the steps of the building and being arrested, right? The Black Lives Matter protesters. Meanwhile, an armed faction of white people stormed the house of the city's mayor. And the only thing that happened because of that was apparently they built her a fence, right? So it didn't happen again. And that was the difference.
We saw just before the killing of George Floyd, and even some after, a wave of protests from the right wing trying to reopen the country and yell about their right to die and kill other people. And those protests were not met with the same ferocity that we're seeing both from local departments and from the federal government when you protest for Black lives. So if you protest because you don't want to have to wear a mask, or you really want to get a haircut, or you can't sit still for a few months, even though you've been prepping for 10 years, then you're met with nothing. But if you protest for Black lives, you're met with tear gas and batons and kidnappings.
So we saw a picture of white supremacists marching behind a line of police officers, and this line of white police officers all looked angry. And it wasn't because they were angry because they were working. It's because they were working and couldn't be in the parade.
There's in Portland, and this really is a lot of context that leads us to the hostilities we have between activists and protesters and the police. We had a wave of humongous protests after Donald Trump was elected, not because of Donald Trump per se, but to try and get our elected officials to step up to avoid situations like where we're at right now. But then after that, we saw this huge invasion of alt-right fascist people from I guess not suburbs, but I think 40 miles outside of any city. You could be in any. They're all the same. You'll see Confederate flags in Oregon if you're 40 minutes outside of Portland. And those people were all gathering and coming into Portland to liberate Portland, right? Because it's liberal and weird. And they would usually come 100, 200 people and be surrounded by thousands of counter-protesters that are protesting this white nationalism with these mini Charlottesville rallies. And the police would always line up with their backs to the alt-right facing anti-fascists. And that occurred so many times that now there's no trust between any sort of activists or protesters and the police, because we've seen them attack us simply for trying to stand up against the alt-right.
Oh, we have that here in Chicago, where the Fraternal Order of Police was actually caught bussing in alt-right white supremacist fascists from Wisconsin for protests here. But real quick, I want to get to some of our most helpful viewers here. They have, apparently you can get a tank and a bazooka. You just have to pay the tax stamp and get a background check for what's known as a destructive device, and it's $200 per projectile. So yes, Portland, you can get a bazooka and a tank. And they offer a website, drivetanks.com. Own one. So,
And I think they offer quite a few payment options too, right? Like you don't have to pay cash. You could 12 easy monthly installments, that kind of thing.
I think they're discussing this on our feed here. They're saying about $1,000 for a PG-7 round. So every time you fire one, it would cost you $1,200. So wait a second, that is an unequal distribution of my rights to the Second Amendment. If I don't have the money, I can't wait. That doesn't seem right. But before we get off on that tangent, and before we let Gregory go, Gregory, what is Brown Hope?
Sorry.
What's Brown Hope? BrownHope.org.
Oh, Brown Hope. It is a nonprofit that is now taken upon itself the Black Resiliency Fund. And actually, the Black Resilience Fund has raised well over $1.4 million just since the protests have occurred. And we just redistribute it to anybody who is Black. So anybody who is Black and is in the Portland area fills out the form. We give them $300, no questions asked. And we've so far given out hundreds of thousands of dollars just since the protests have begun. And so it's really a beacon of light of what's going on here in Portland. It's getting support from our senators. It's actually the largest fund for Black people in the state of Oregon. And so we're really just trying to in a time where people have lost their jobs because of COVID or are feeling really hurt because of what's going on with the national unrest, etc., be able to be a safety net for people in a time where the government has sort of abandoned that duty.
Well, that almost sounds like socialism.
Yeah, I mean, it was set out to raise $10,000, and we could have never expected to have well over 1 million, but we have hundreds of volunteers that are helping to get it out. So it is a bit like racial socialism because it's mostly either wealthy individuals or just white individuals that are trying to put money into our Black community. So it's really direct. There's no oversight. Every single cent. We don't have paid staff. So anything that would be an oversight cost is volunteer or donated. So every single cent is going into the Black community here in Portland, and it's been great to see all of the support that it's gotten.
That's wonderful. So for our viewers here, we will post a link to, well, it's pretty easy, brownhope.org. And then I'll try and find the link to Riot Ribs because I'm all about helping people enjoy good ribs. And if you can get some food and sustenance in Portland while you are peacefully protesting and exercising your First Amendment rights, why not?
And who doesn't like barbecue?
Right.
Can I say one more thing? I think it's really important also for people to donate to and tip the local journalists and the live streamers that you're seeing out there on the streets. Most of them were freelance reporters that have no jobs now, that are not making any money, but are still going out there every single night and really letting the true story be told rather than what you're seeing on. Not that I don't want to be the anti-First Amendment, anti-CNN person like from the right, but I will tell you that you're not going to get the real story about Portland from national media. So watch the live streamers and tip them if you can.
Since you won't, I will be. Fuck corporate media. We hate CNN. We hate MSNBC. We hate Fox News because they are all part of that building that narrative against people. So this is why we here also don't have paywalls or anything like that. We want to get these stories out, so we have guests like Gregory, and we support places like Unicorn Riot. And then there were a bunch of journalists we featured last week, and we will put links out to their Twitter feeds. Raindrop was one of them. Hi, Raindrop. And just make sure that everybody gets access to them. And if you're a journalist in Portland, put your Patreon or your PayPal or whatever it is, Venmo, so that people can drop you a tip. Just a few dollars can make a huge difference, especially when it comes to independent journalism and things like that. So thanks for that segue there, Gregory. Appreciate it. Yeah.
And I think that Gregory's brownhope.com org would be a lovely template for other cities, right? It seems to me that your stimulus package is bigger than the federal government's.
We're more efficient, certainly.
Yeah, it sounds like
and a little more inclusive.
Absolutely.
So
well, that's great.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you for having me, and I'll always come back if you ever want somebody from Portland.
Absolutely, absolutely, and this is part of what we do, why we do what we do here, independent media. We're obviously progressive, which is center policy. So happy to have the real story from people on the ground who know it. And Gregory, you have been such a beacon. I checked into your career, and I'm blown away by all the work that you've done and where you are now, and you just keep giving back to the people. So thank you for all that you do. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for getting the story out. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Andy, we have some stuff coming up here on our network. We've got you just finished some work for Rome, for Rome's Rebellion.
Yes.
And then I have an interview with Stringer Harris, who is another activist here in the Chicago area, but he is now helping out in Joliet. And I mentioned at the beginning of the show, Joliet is having a similar issue, a mini Portland. They are arresting protesters with no charges, no crimes committed, just want to get them. And they are freely admitting that they are arresting people to keep them from protesting. There's no crime. That's a civil rights violation. So if you are a taxpayer in Illinois or in the city of Joliet, your taxes are about to go into the pockets of protesters who sue your city. This is part of the reason why in Congress now they want to make it take away the shield laws for officers so that you can sue the officer directly instead of taking it from our taxes.
Exactly. Right? That's a lovely deterrent for breaking the law as a law enforcement agent. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, well, media companies, newspapers, everything else, we have to have liability insurance. Why shouldn't you as an officer? Why shouldn't you, like, if you work in marketing or any of these professional fields, you should have a liability policy. Why not a police officer so that they themselves have to be mindful of their own conduct instead of me as a taxpayer paying for them to violate your rights?
Well, and let's remember that, you know, the Dark Lord of the Senate, you know, Valda McConnell, has told publicly that the federal government should just let states go bankrupt. Right? Why that would be the best way to deal with their debt. Let's just let them go bankrupt. And now we're seeing different reports that the states' governments are shutting down facilities that actually help people because they're running out of money. But who's not running out of money?
The federal government.
Or on a local level, the police forces.
There's that.
Who seem to be able to get as much tear gas and pepper spray and rubber bullets and live ammunition as they need.
Oh,
isn't that nice?
Yeah, against our own citizens. So we've got those interviews coming up this week, and then Andy and I have another special guest coming on Wednesday, and we will talk about whistleblowers. Whistleblowers and all sorts of good fun stuff. So when people say, where are the good officers? What are they doing? Again, I'm going to go back to Joliet. There was a whistleblower there, an officer who did the right thing. He had his badge taken away. And that's what they did to him. So we're going to talk about that and all sorts of other whistleblowers and things. The reality of the situation we're in. We're in a no-win catch-22. So let's push back on all of these myths and arguments that are coming from the fascists and the alt-right. Let's dispel them all. So, all right. So thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Mike and Dave, for your comments. Mike absolutely agrees. He says lawyers and doctors need malpractice insurance. Why not cops? Totally agree. Andy, any parting words or thoughts before we get out of here today?
No, I'm actually in a good place right now. I thought that was lovely to talk to Gregory. I just, you know, I think that we need to elevate those voices of the activists that, you know, have a heart that's 5 miles wide, that just want to help people for the right reasons, have a moral center that's huge, and those voices need to be elevated above the din and sound of live ammunition going off.
Oh yeah, and far above the voices of like Chuck Todd, who called me a brown shirt for wanting Medicare for all. Ugh. Okay, so if you happen to know an activist, you are an activist, or you know somebody who's doing something great in the community to help others outside of themselves, we want to talk to them. That's why we do what we do.
And I don't have to tell you that if you have red hair, brown looks awful.
That's true. That's true. I'm more of a winter. So yeah, you're right, Andy. Good call. But all right, with that, we will get out of here, and we will see you back here Wednesday morning, bright and early, 10 a.m. Eastern. Thank you so much for everyone who participated. And to Gregory, go follow him on Twitter. We will post all the links to his charities, to Riot Ribs, as well as Brown Hope. And seriously, Google this guy. He's a badass. So we were so privileged to have him on this morning. For everyone here, thank you so much. And remember to support independent journalism.
Take care.